you're all very welcome to Kefron's webinar on E-Invoicing and ViDA. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Kearns. I am the Head of International Markets at Kefron. And what we're going to cover off is, well, we're first going to start on unpacking ViDA and E-Invoicing terminology. So I think there's lots of different concepts out there, and I want to try and just make sure that everyone's on a level playing field to understand some of the core concepts. I'm then going to deep dive into some of the upcoming ViDA mandates and E-Invoicing mandates. I'm then going to jump into building a roadmap for compliance. So I think probably the nature of e-invoicing and ViDA legislation is probably causing a lot of angst in the market. So I want to give you some tangible 6-step guide on what you can expect and what you should probably do if you do have mandates upcoming in your organization. And then I'm going to give you an indication of timelines and pricing. So we will cover exactly how long these types of projects take, what kind of things you need to be thinking about, and I'll give you an overview of what the pricing element looks like also, because obviously that's a key element of evaluating this type of technology. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about why e-invoicing is being introduced. Okay, and if you take away, some of the things like modernization, simplification, efficiency, which is information that's being shared by the European Union, which is all extremely true, really what they're trying to address is this VAT cap. And for those of you who don't know, the VAT cap is effectively what the European Union member states expect to collect each year and what they actually collect. In 2020 alone, the VAT cap was 99 billion euro. Okay, so a pretty sizable chunk. And what I thought I'd do for this section of today's session is just walk you through the as-is process. And then when we introduce e-invoicing or ViDA legislation, what the to-be process is going to be in a purchase or a sales process. So today, if we take it from the top, if we think about the as-is process, from a VAT reporting perspective, as you know, businesses report VAT liabilities usually in arrears on a monthly or quarterly basis. Tax authorities typically rely on periodic submissions rather than transaction level visibility. Okay, so that's the as-is process today. When we introduce e-invoicing and the European Union move towards ViDA legislation by 2030 across EU member states, what that will shift to is ultimately VAT reporting. So governments require real-time or near real-time monitoring of transactions, which ultimately reduces the reliance on retrospective VAT returns. Okay, so again, a big pillar of the e-invoicing and ViDA mandates that are incoming. Secondly, is invoice submission. So today, there's no real requirement for invoices to be sent directly to the tax authority during a sales or purchase process. And as you know, again, if you're a Kefron customer, invoices are exchanged only between the buyer and supplier. Okay. Moving forward in the to-be process, all invoices will be transmitted to the tax authority portal or a clearance system, and we'll get into those a little bit more in the next couple of slides, for approval before being shared with the buyer. And lastly, formats. So today, again, there's no standard or mandated format for invoices to be submitted to the tax authority. So you could technically submit the invoices or the information from a VAT perspective via paper, via PDF, via CSV file, or via an XML. But what we're really moving towards is a standardized method to enable system-to-system data exchange. And ultimately, the mandate is going to dictate what those formats may be. So each individual country may have their own specific format. It's typically going to be an XML file, but ultimately these are the formats that are going to have to be used to be compliant for these mandates for sending or receiving an e-invoice. So that's just a bit of an overview of the as-is process and then the to-be process moving forward as CTC or e-invoicing is being introduced. I thought it would be useful now to jump into some of the terminology that you'll start to see and hear more and more of. And I want to start with CTC, which is obviously an acronym that you'll hear quite regularly. I guess the first thing to say is CTC stands for Continuous Transaction Control. So it's the ultimate in tax authority control. The best way to think about CTC is ultimately the big brother of tax collection. And there's two types of CTC mandates. So there's a clearance CTC or there's a reporting element. Now, if we deep dive into those in a little bit more detail, clearance effectively means that the tax authority must approve that invoice in a sales or a purchase process. So I always say to people when I'm talking to them, think of it as asking the taxman for permission before you actually send the invoice, right? So that's one element of CTC. The other element is reporting. And reporting effectively means that invoices don't need pre-approval from the tax authority, but they do eventually need to be reported to them in a near real-time basis. And I always say, think of it as just telling the taxman what you've already sent. So they're the two types of CTC that we're going to discuss in today's session, a clearance model or a CTC reporting model effectively. In terms of the different types of actual models or the way in which data is transferred, so invoice data is transferred, to break that down into a little bit more detail, I'm going to talk about the concept of these different models. So an e-invoicing model refers to how actual invoice data is transmitted in each country. And there's two e-invoicing models that are more commonly used than others. One is a centralized model, and the other is a decentralized model. So let's dive into that. A centralized model ultimately means that the invoice must pass through a single government platform before delivery to the buyer. So for example, the Italian mandate has been in place since 2019, and that's a centralized model. Okay, so the invoice from a sales or a purchase process has to be submitted to the tax authority in Italy before processed for payment. Think of it as airport security, right? All invoices must pass one checkpoint before delivery. A decentralized model effectively means that multiple service providers are able to exchange the data using common standards. And a common example of this would be the Belgium or the Danish mandate, and they're using a service provider or a model using the PEPL network. Okay, the best way to think about that type of model is phone networks, right? So we're all probably using different phone networks, whether it's EE, whether it's 3, whether it's Vodafone, different providers, same standards, they all connect phone calls. So again, very, very similar analogy to try and help unpick the two different types. So ultimately, when you look at a mandate, it's typically going to be a clearance or a reporting CTC, and then it's going to be a centralized or a decentralized model. Now, this may add a little bit of confusion, but there's also a post-audit model, which ultimately means that businesses can exchange invoices directly with each other, and then the tax authority only checks them at a later date, usually in an audit program. What I would say about this, the post-audit model will start to fade out as ViDA legislation is introduced, and most countries eventually will either be a centralized model, a decentralized model, and using either CTC clearance or CTC reporting. Okay, the reason I'm flagging the post-audit model is because the next two mandates that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail are Germany and Belgium, which are upcoming mandates. And they are post-audit models. So there's no requirement for clearance, right? So for ultimately getting the invoice pre-approved, it's not a centralized model because it's not going directly to the tax authority. It's not a reporting model, but ultimately you exchange the invoices between the buyer and the seller via a network or a third party, and you must be able to provide that information to the tax authority when they require it during an audit. Okay, so we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. The next thing we're going to dive into is upcoming mandates. Okay, so I think I touched on this at the top of the call. What we're going to focus on is 4 upcoming mandates. I will say that Kefron is compliant and supports countries, over 60 countries. Okay, so if you don't see or I don't go into details specifically of the mandate that you're concerned about or thinking about, again, we're going to send you really, really great content, which is a compliance timeline that gives you information on the timeline associated with the country that you may be operating in. And then we're also going to give you a readiness guide. So we're going to give you a really deep dive breakdown on each individual mandate that's upcoming. What I'm going to focus on first, as I said, is the German mandate. So hopefully this isn't too painful on the eyes, but really what I'm trying to give you an overview here is the scope, the key requirements, and what's probably pressing for most of you, the timeline. So if we start with the scope, who does it affect? Resident taxpayers in Germany. What? B2G or business to government is not included. Business to consumer, again, is not included. B2B under the mandate is included, so transactions business to business is included, but for now, okay, up until January 2027, it's only for inbound, so accounts payable invoices. Now, if you are concerned about having a provider that can support you with both AP and AR, we can support you on both sides of the fence. So that is really important to point out. I know for Kefron AP customers that are using our product today, you may be thinking we can only help you with one of the flows, but we can definitely support on both the inbound and the inbound. So I'll cover that off. In terms of the CTC type, which we touched on previously, it's a post-audit model, okay? So it doesn't require clearance. In other words, it doesn't require connectivity to the tax authority in Germany yet. Again, that will change, and we'll get onto that. And it doesn't require real-time reporting, okay? It's not a centralized network because, again, there's no requirement for connectivity to the government portal, but it is a decentralized, okay? So you will require third-party functionality, maybe provided by a company like Kefron, or maybe your ERP system can support you with that to support the inbound flow for AP invoices under the German mandate. I'm not going to dive too deep into the key requirements because I am going to show you a bit of a workflow diagram that gives you an indication of actually how this works in practice. But I really am referring to the German mandate as kind of a light mandate. And the reason I'm referring to it as a light mandate is because, number one, it only affects one flow, so inbound. Number two, it's not a clearance or reporting mandate right now. And then number three, from the timeline perspective, you can see it's a little bit muddled in some way, but we understand why the German Ministry of Finance have went down this road. If you look at the timeline, ultimately from January 2025, all suppliers may opt to issue electronic invoices or e-invoices without the buyer's consent, okay? If you're operating in Germany as a business, you must be able to receive those e-invoices, okay? And I'm going to come on to the two formats that you must be able to receive. However, what's kind of adding to the light mandate piece is non-compliant e-invoicing is allowed if it's agreed between the two parties. So if you mutually agree between your supplier and your buyer that we're going to continue to send PDF documents, obviously you can continue to do that and you will be compliant. But you must have the availability and the functionality to be able to support receiving e-invoices. This will change. Okay, so by January 2027, businesses with an annual turnover of over 800K must be able to issue structured e-invoices. Okay, and by January 2028, all businesses, so whether your turnover is greater than 800,000 or not, all businesses must be able to issue structured e-invoices. Okay, if we deep dive a little bit more into actual flow, and I'm just going to focus on the AP workflow for today. So if we take it from left to right, a supplier generates an e-invoice, okay, and the e-invoice format that they will generate is going to come in two forms. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation for any German attendees, but you've got two file formats down here, the Extragung and the Zugford. The Extragung is commonly used in business to government transactions, and the Zugford is more commonly used in B2B transactions. Ultimately, how this is going to work from an AP perspective, the supplier is going to generate the e-invoice. If you were using Kefron to support this mandate in Germany, Kefron is going to take that file format. It's typically an XML, and usually it may have an embedded PDF in the actual file itself. The Kefron solution is going to open that document, it's going to convert it, and it's going to convert it to a human-readable PDF. The reason we're doing that is ultimately because an XML file, if you've ever seen one, is hundreds of lines of code. It's very difficult to decipher. We want to be able to convert that XML document into a human-readable PDF. We want to put it through your workflow in the Kefron solution. So whether it's a non-PO invoice that needs to go for approval, or it's a purchase order invoice that needs to be matched against an associated purchase order. At that point, from an archiving perspective, under the mandate, the documents need to be archived for a period of 10 years. And the German Ministry of Finance have recently added some clarifications on that. So the XML is the key document. So the e-invoice itself is the key document that needs to be archived. So in the Kefron solution, you'll have access to the XML for archiving purposes, but you'll also have a PDF representation So if you are a human and you need to resolve a query or discrepancy, you don't need to decipher loads of lines of code effectively. At that point, once it goes through your workflow, once the document is archived, we're going to post that data into your ERP or accounting system ready for payment. Okay, so hopefully a relatively straightforward overview of the German mandate and how the Kefron solution inserts itself in that process. I'm now going to move on to the Belgium mandate. So the Belgium mandate is probably the most pressing for most of the Kefron customer base. I appreciate there's also prospective customers on today's call. So again, in terms of the Belgium mandate, a little bit different. Okay, in terms of who it affects, VAT registered taxpayers in Belgium, foreign non-established VAT registered taxpayers. You can see what's included, and then excluded is typically things that you would expect, right? Insolvent companies, B2G and B2C transactions. In Belgium, it's B2B and it's both outbound and inbound. Okay, so the mandate stipulates that you must be able to send an e-invoice and you must be able to receive an e-invoice in Belgium. Again, in terms of the CTC type, it's a post-audit country, so there's no requirement for real-time connectivity or reporting to the tax authority or approval of the invoice to the tax authority, but it does need to be made available from an archiving perspective. It's a decentralized network, which ultimately means third parties are available to support the connectivity and the transmitting of data. And the Belgium mandate is using a network, which most of you are probably familiar with, is the PEPAL network. Okay, and again, the PEPAL network is going to be used to support e-invoicing in decentralized models for lots of different countries. Okay, and it's more commonly used, in retail, in public sector, in higher education, and things like that. In terms of the timeline, mandatory B2B e-invoicing is coming in via PEPAL, and the mandatory date is January 1st, 2026. Okay, so if you are an organization that haven't got set up to be compliant, you've got a VAT registered taxpayer entity, or you're a foreign non-established VAT registered taxpayer in Belgium, you do need to be compliant by 1st January 2026 to be able to send and receive e-invoices via the PEPAL network. In terms of how Kefron supports with this process, again, we'll take an e-invoice or an AP flow, and then I'll move on to the AOR flow so you get a visibility of both. In this case, the supplier is going to generate the e-invoice. Okay, the e-invoice format for Belgium is a PEPAL BIS format. It is an XML file ultimately. The supplier is going to generate the e-invoice and it's going to send the data to the registered access point. Now, Kefron are going to give you the details of the access point for the supplier to send that invoice to. So we're going to act as your Kefron PEPAL access point. Once the information is transmitted to the PEPAL access point, again, similar to the German mandate, we're going to call the PEPAL access point via an API. We're going to take that information from the PEPAL access point, transmit that data into Kefron, provide a human readable PDF, and put it through your workflows. Okay, at that point, we're going to post the data ready into the ERP system, ready for payment. The key thing here is Kefron is a verified and certified PEPAL access point. Okay, so we will be able to act as your access point if you don't have one, and we'll provide the details and the support in registering and getting set up as an access point, so you can give that information to suppliers to submit the information to the correct access point, so then we can provide the information to support. If we focus on the AOR process, so actually issuing e-invoices, and again, Kefron customers may be thinking, how can you support with the AP and AOR process? You're an accounts payable automation platform. Well, we also support the AOR process, because ultimately what happens in an AOR process is you're going to generate your AOR payload, okay? And the payload is effectively, again, a PEPAL compliant XML payload, right? So it's usually in one of those two formats. Most ERP systems on the market are going to be able to support that process, so generating an XML. The payload data is transmitted again to the PEPAL access point. We'll pull that information or call that information from the access point. We'll get it into the Kefron data banks, and then we'll post that data to the Kefron or to the customer access point, so their access point via PEPAL. Okay, so that's a flip of the previous scenario when we were talking about AP. The AOR process, obviously, there is a responsibility on you to generate the data from your ERP or accounting software. Again, most ERP systems will enable that functionality to support you. We're going to take that data, act as the access point, and then get that data to the customer access point. Poland. Okay, so this is when it starts to get a little bit more complex. And the two complex mandates are Poland and France, which I'm going to cover off in today's session. You can see there's a lot more writing on this slide, so hopefully, again, it's not too painful on your eyes, but I'm going to cover off the key elements, which I think are important for you to take away. Again, if you're an organization that has an entity registered in Poland. So in terms of who, again, it's VAT registered companies, domestic and foreign with PL business establishment, right? So Polish business establishment and VAT exempted taxpayers also. In terms of B2G, this will come compliant, right? So the B2G element will be compliant and it will function next to the KSF, which is the tax authority in Poland. B2C, there is plans to include this in the mandatory phase in February 2026, but that's not confirmed as of yet. For B2B, it covers both outbound and inbound. Okay, and here's the slight change. The CTC type is clearance. Okay, so ultimately it means the tax authority in Poland must receive an invoice, whether it's on the sales or the purchase process, for pre-approval before it goes to be processed for payment ultimately. Again, it's a centralized model, okay, which means it has to go to the tax authority. Okay, so a couple of options in terms of connecting to the tax authority, but obviously for today's session, I'm going to cover off how Kefron can support you in this process. The Polish mandate has been a difficult one for most software vendors to support, mainly because of the timeline. So what you'll start to see and hear more about with all of these mandates is the Ministry of Finance in that country will announce the mandate, they'll announce the specification and the plans for the mandate. They'll give a deadline, usually 12 to 18 months out. But what's really challenging for organizations in Poland, but also for software vendors trying to navigate resource, is most of the mandates that have been announced have been postponed, unfortunately. So Poland, for example, in January 2024, that was the initial rollout period. So that was the initial mandate deadline. That was then postponed to July 2024. And now, as you can see, it's been postponed until February 2026. Okay, without getting into too much of the detail, the KSF, when you hear that terminology, just relates to the tax authority in Poland. And the tax authority connectivity or portal is being made available to connect to that tax authority on the 30th of September. Okay, so we don't have loads of time to be able to do the testing, the implementation, and then ensure customers are live by February 2026. So if you are a customer that has a VAT registered entity in Poland, you're operating in Poland, it's really, really important that you get ahead of the curve as quickly as you can, particularly for this mandate. Okay, so February 1st, 2026, sending and receiving invoices via the KSF is going to become mandatory, and it's very, very unlikely that this mandate will be postponed, given the amount of work that the Ministry of Finance in Poland have put into it, but also because of the previous postponements. Okay. So in terms of supporting this process, a little bit different, a little bit more information on the diagram. So I'm just going to focus on an AP process. Again, I can't stress enough, we can support, and Kefron can support with an inbound or an outbound flow, so AP or AOR invoices. But I'm going to focus on an AP process to give you an idea of what this will look like. A supplier is going to generate an E-invoice. Okay, again, you're probably seeing a common trend. The E-invoice format for Poland is FA2, FAVAT. It's XML based, okay? And ultimately what's going to happen is the supplier is going to generate the E-invoice. And the first thing that has to happen is it needs to go to the tax authority, okay? So ultimately the supplier generates the E-invoice, it goes to the tax authority, and at that point, the tax authority effectively has a traffic light system. So green, good to go. Amber, more clarification. Red, it's rejected. Once it's received, you will get confirmation and confirmation notification back to let you know that it's been received and it's been approved. And then at that point where Kefron comes into the process, is Kefron is going to call the KSF or the Polish tax authority via an API to pull that invoice data into the Kefron solution.
At this point, the tax authority is going to effectively send that data from the tax authority to the Kefron solution. So we're going to use an API to connect to the tax authority. Okay, we're going to pull that e-invoice and we're going to generate a PDF representation in the Kefron solution. And then similar to the other processes, we're going to post that data ready for payment into the ERP system. Buyer's also going to not get a notification by the KSF, okay, but the supplier needs to communicate that the invoice is available, right? So that's important to note also. So again, really key in the clearance model, the supplier is going to generate the e-invoice. It does need to go for clearance from the tax authority in that country. The Kefron solution is going to call the KSF, okay, via an API. And then at that point, what's going to happen is we're going to generate a PDF representation of the document, put it through your workflows, and post it into your ERP or accounting software. So hopefully that makes sense. Some of you may be wondering, how does Kefron connect to all of these tax authorities? And ultimately, the Kefron solution is supported by our partner Sovus. And for those of you who don't know Sovus, they're a global leader in e-invoicing. And ultimately what they've supported us with is a co-API to enable us to connect to over 60 tax authorities. So we're going to use their technology, use it to connect to each individual tax authority and pull that information. The Kefron team are going to manage the implementation end to end. So moving forward, France. Okay, so there's a lot to cover off in the France mandate, but I'm going to cover it off in as quickly and probably comprehensively as possible. So if we take the what on the left-hand side, so what it includes, B2B domestic sales must be electronically invoiced and reported on the fly to the tax administration. Trading parties must exchange e-invoice statuses and report them to the tax administration. There is an e-reporting requirement, so data related to other transactions, cross-border B2B sales and supplies, and B2C sales must be periodically e-reported. So that's typically going to be on a quarterly basis. And then from a payments perspective, the supplier must electronically report received payments for goods services sold. In terms of how, I'm going to walk you through this on the next slide. So you do have options with the French mandate to use a PPF or a PDP. Okay, so an intermediate like Kefron or the tax authority portal via the PPF. And I'll come on to that in the next stage. From an obligation perspective, if we take the e-invoicing obligation, on the 1st of September 2026, all French companies that you can see on screen, so about 4 million French companies, by the 1st of September 2026, must be able to receive an e-invoice from suppliers. Okay, so kind of similar to the German mandate, you must be able to receive those e-invoices. Okay, 1st of September 2026, for large organizations in France, you must be able to send e-invoices. Okay. 1st of September 2027, again, you must be able to send e-invoices, and there is an e-reporting obligation. Okay, so you must be able to periodically report on those transactions also. In terms of Kefron support with the French mandate, and I appreciate that this is relatively high level, but we will get into this in more detail as the specifications and more details come out in association with the French mandate. We've obviously got 12 months to go, but again, that 12 months will go relatively quickly. But I wanted to focus in on two options. So if you're an organization, you've got an opportunity in France to support the e-invoicing mandate, or I guess opportunity is maybe the wrong word, but if you need to be compliant to support the French mandate, you've got two options: the PPF or a PDP. So the PPF is ultimately the government-run free platform. Okay, so there is a portal provided by the tax authority in France to allow you to use their government-run free platform. A PDP is effectively a partner, and the French government have certified a number of providers that can connect to the PPF on your behalf. So you may be thinking, well, if one option is free and one is via a third party like Kefron, why wouldn't I use the French option? And I think I always try and use analogies to unpick these. I think it's probably the difference between maybe a supermarket and a meal delivery service, right? So the supermarket, is the PPF. So you need to go to the supermarket, you need to buy the ingredients, you need to come home, you need to make the meal. The PDP is probably more like a meal delivery service, right? So ultimately you order the meal and we or another third party is going to support actually delivering that meal directly to you. And really what I mean by that, it really depends on the type of organization that you are and ultimately what you're looking for. So from a PPF perspective, if you're an organization that has low invoice volume, you've got small domestic operations, you don't necessarily need integration between different systems. So you don't have an AP or an AOR system. You don't need integration to your accounting or ERP system. You're okay to just download those documents from the PPF. And you don't require workflow or analytics or detailed reporting directly associated with these e-invoices. The PPF is probably a good option for your organization. On the flip side, in the meal delivery element, if you've got medium to high invoice volume, so I'm probably talking, anywhere from 500 to 5 or 10,000 invoices a month, you're multi-entity, multinational, and you're cross-border, you do require connectivity direct to the ERP or your AP and AOR workflows, and then you need archiving and analytics. The PDP or a provider that is certified by the French government to support this process is probably a good fit. Okay, obviously I would say that given that Kefron is a registered PDP via our partnership with the global e-invoicing leader Sovos, okay, which I've touched on previously, but ultimately we can support you in making that best decision. And ultimately our role as advisors is to give you the information that you need to make those informed decisions. Okay, so again, if you're an organization in France, you need to support the mandate. You've got two options to support it. And again, we'll help you make the best fit. In terms of a roadmap for compliance, so a lot of the feedback that I've had from different organizations is just where do we start, right? So I really wanted to try and give everyone for today's session a bit of an understanding or a guide on, from my perspective, dealing with these types of invoice projects for the last 12 months particularly, what you can do to try and get ready from a compliance perspective. So let's walk through that. So basically what I've done is I've tried to create 6 stages for e-invoicing compliance. The first stage is a country-by-country compliance audit. So what I would do, if you're a finance or if you're in the information technology team or you're in the tax team, the first thing you need to do is list out every country where you've got a registered entity. Okay, not countries that you operate or sell into, but where you've got a registered tax entity. Check the mandate status and the deadlines. Okay, Nicole in our marketing department has done an amazing compliance timeline, which you'll all get access to after today's session, which will be really useful for you to be able to do this country by country audit. And then identify the CTC model. And again, we've got an amazing piece of content which will break down the specifics of each individual mandate so you can understand, is it a clearance, is it real-time reporting, or is it post-audit? So that's step 1. Step 2 is you definitely need to get a handle on your transaction volume assessment. So you need to understand how many AP invoices are we receiving in that country and how many AOR invoices are we sending in that country. This is obviously really important if you speak to someone like me or anyone in my team about supporting you on the pricing element, which I'll come on to support your e-invoicing requirement. Okay, because as you probably have guessed, the pricing element is definitely associated with the volume of transactions that you're processing. The third thing I would do is an internal system evaluation. So I'd map out my ERP, my AP automation, and my AOR systems used in each country. Again, if you're a global organization, speaking to one yesterday, a global property management organization, they've got different AP systems, they've got different accounting or ERP systems. It's important to check if these systems support natively e-invoicing. So some of the more modern ERP systems may be able to provide you functionality out of the box. It's unlikely, but there may be some functionality to support. For example, if you're in Belgium and you need to generate a payload or an AOR invoice for the Belgium mandate, again, just checking that they can generate that payload in that format is important. And then what we're trying to do is just identify gaps. Okay, so if you're on a legacy ERP system, they don't have the ability to generate an XML report or receive XML documents. Again, we can support you with that, but it's important that you try and understand what's available to you right now in the systems and processes that you've got currently. Number 4 is just deciding your operating model. So ultimately, you've got 2 main options, right? You use one e-invoicing provider that can support all subsidiaries and all entities. Okay, so a one solution for global compliance effectively, or what some of our customers have done and other organizations potentially could do is use a local supplier for each individual country. Hybrid approaches are common, I would say. Obviously, there's benefits to having one solution and one point of contact for all of your e-invoicing needs, but there is probably, you know, if you're late to the e-invoicing element, you know, you've got an entity in Italy, you probably already have an Italian e-invoicing solution in place to support that country. So again, hybrid approaches are common. Obviously, we would recommend going with one provider and one solution to support all the countries. But again, it's obviously at the discretion of the organization. 5th point is around vendor or platform selection. So hopefully this is something that we can support you on. From a geographic coverage perspective, I think these are some of the things that you should evaluate potential vendors on. So what countries do they support? It will be rare to find a solution that supports every single country. Okay, so you can see e-invoicing mandates coming in Saudi Arabia, in Kenya, in Mauritius. Obviously, we've partnered with Sobus, who are a global leader in e-invoicing, to support as many countries as possible. We're now compliant in over 60 countries. Okay, so it will be difficult to find one we're not compliant in, but again, those edge cases may be something that we could struggle to support you with. So it is important to make sure that whatever solution you work with can support you in all the countries that you need support on. Obviously, integration to your accounting system and ERP system and experience doing that is important, because ultimately the data is going to reside in that system. And then track record, right? So how many successful e-invoicing projects have they delivered? And that's obviously important. E-invoicing for most of us is relatively new, and that means that for most software vendors it's relatively new. So understanding the track record that they've got, what countries they've gone live in, timelines, costings, that kind of thing is obviously important. And then finally, I'd align and engage. Okay, so you know, if you're responsible for the e-invoicing project in your organization, it is important to engage with local finance teams early, probably to support you with points 1 and 2, right? To understand what systems they're using, what process that they've got in place, and what volumes that they have. Your tax team is going to play an important role in this, okay? And most of the tax people that are on today's session will be aware of that. Your ERP or your technical or your infrastructure team, you will need to work with closely to make sure that we can integrate to different systems. And you should definitely use the content that we provide from today's session to try and create a rollout plan out to 2028. Okay, so over the next 3 years, to make sure that these projects don't creep up and then you're in a mad rush towards the end, which some people are for the Belgian mandate or the German mandate, for example, to get it done as quickly as possible because they're worried about compliance. So they're the 6 key stages as a provider and with experience of these projects that I would encourage you to think about. I'm going to really quickly talk through the implementation timeline and Kefron pricing, because we are coming towards the end of today's session and I want to make sure that I can cover some of your questions. So from an e-invoicing project plan, we've delivered probably 10, 15 of these projects in different countries as of today. And we've got 10 or 15 more planned for the next 3 to 6 months. The first stage is scoping and readiness. Okay, so really what we're trying to do is assess country-specific mandates, identify the ERP system, the integration points, understand what compliance gaps that you have as an organization, and then we're going to confirm the high-level scope, objectives, and the timeline for implementation. We're going to then move to solution design. So again, it's really important that we understand the mandates, okay, and we can translate that information to you. But ultimately what we're trying to do is it a centralized or a decentralized model? Do we need to connect to PEPL, or do we need to connect directly to the tax authority? We need to choose the connection method and design the flows. Okay, so because it's an e-invoice, it still needs to go through your workflow. We need to agree on the formats and make sure that we can support those formats, and then define the archive and reporting requirements. Okay, so for some countries it's 7 years, for others it's 10. Obviously we can support on whatever the mandate stipulates in terms of archiving, but it is important to make sure that we box those off. We'll then move into implementation, which is ultimately configuring the e-invoicing platform settings, setting up the workflows, and then we're establishing the test environments, which is obviously extremely important for connectivity to the tax authority. Phase 4, we're into system integration, and that becomes a little bit more complex if it's a clearance model and requires connectivity to the tax authority in that portal, because these tax authorities are new. We've done projects in Malaysia, in Italy, in different countries, India, for example, and obviously connectivity to those portals and testing over a 2-week period is extremely important. So this is the most critical element of the e-invoicing implementation phase. And then the final phase is obviously go live. Okay, so final data migration, we do a cutover process to make sure that everything is connected and working correctly. We give you a week of hypercare to make sure that your team are confident and supported throughout the process by your implementation team. And then we're going to hand you over to our support team for BAU. I would say that in my experience, you should allow for a minimum of 8 to 16 weeks for the delivery of these implementations. Okay. 8 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks for a light mandate, right? So for Germany and Belgium, for example, and then for a clearance mandate for Poland, for France in particular, which is a little bit more complex. Again, we probably want to give those 12 to 16 weeks just to give you enough breathing space with other projects that you may have ongoing to make sure that you can give the necessary time and effort and attention to it. From a pricing perspective, relatively straightforward. If you're a Kefron customer, this will be no great surprise to you. If you're a prospective customer, there's 2 elements to our pricing. One is the implementation element to set up the connectivity to the government portals, to connect to PEPL, to do the conversion of the documents and the mapping element. You'll get a fixed implementation fee for each individual country. So we don't do time and materials. We will give you a fixed implementation fee. We will support you on a compliance knowledge share piece. Okay, so to make sure that you actually fully understand the mandate and the stipulations. And our implementation day rate is €950 per day. Obviously, each individual mandate varies on the price, but again, as we discuss and as you follow up, or we follow up, I should say, going through your requirements, we can make sure that we give you a fixed implementation fee for each individual country. There is also a monthly recurring subscription fee, as you would probably expect to support this process. Okay, it does apply to each individual country, which is really important to stress. So if you've got multiple locations, multiple countries, you will be charged for each individual country because there is a connection fee that we obviously need to support. The volume of transactions will include both AP and AR, okay? And the monthly subscription fee is starting at €325 per month. So to give you an example, if you've got a small entity in Belgium, they're sending 200 invoices a month, they're receiving 200 invoices a month, you're allowed to process up to 500 invoices, AP and AR, for that monthly fee of 325, and then we go through the different document volume bands. My contact details are directly on screen. So if you do need or want to reach out to me, I appreciate this is, it's been as detailed as I could in 45 minutes, but I appreciate there's probably lots and lots of questions. Please reach out to me directly. But let's go through some of these questions. So Peter has asked, what countries does Kefron support? Okay, so this comes up quite regularly, Peter. The Kefron solution through our partnership with Sovus is compliant in over 60 countries. As part of the follow-up to today's session, we'll send you information of all of the countries that we do support, the majority of which are in the European Union, okay, but there are some edge cases for countries that we do support that are outside the European Union, for example, in APAC. Do some governments offer grants, loans in the purchase of e-invoicing systems, or does the company bear the full cost? It's a good question. It depends, unfortunately, on the individual country. So some countries will support you getting up and live to connect to the tax authority. Obviously, some countries do provide a free portal. So for France, for example, via the PPF to connect directly to the tax authority portal, which obviously gives you a free access to that. But for all of the functionality that I've showed you in terms of the connectivity, the workflows, the analytics, the connectivity to your ERP system and the automated posting, you may be able to get grants, but you will need to check in that individual country. James, typically do organizations need to invest in a third-party tool, or can some ERP systems handle e-invoicing functions? That's a really good question. I think one of the points that I made in terms of your compliance roadmap, the first point of call is discussed with your account manager at your ERP or accounting system. Obviously, as you would expect, because of the number of countries that they're going to need to support, it will be very difficult even for monster ERP systems to be able to support all of those countries probably as effectively as they would like. That is why Kefron made the decision not to try and build our own functionality to support connectivity to each individual tax authority. So first protocol, discuss with your ERP system. They will be able to provide you some basic functionality, okay, but may not be able to cover everything. But that is a good point. Definitely speak to your ERP provider. Okay, I think that was the last question, unless there's any more popping through. There's not. So thank you all for joining. Keep in mind those mandates may be postponed, but it's better to be prudent and better to start the process, again, as I say, at least 12 to 16 weeks out, to give you the opportunity to make sure that you're compliant. I hope today's session was useful. I appreciate it was quick and in some cases high level. Please do reach out to me. You've got my contact details on screen.